The audience chamber of the Sorath sovereignty's primary court had the specific quality of spaces that had absorbed 30 years of significant confrontations. The accumulated weight of the decisions that had been made in it, the words that had been said, the silences that had followed the words. The walls held all of it in the way that spaces held things, not visibly, but in the quality of the air and the light, and the particular stillness that came from a room that had been the site of enough significant things that significance itself had become the room's character. Davanrel stood in the room and did not flinch. He had been standing for 11 minutes while the Queen finished reading the summons documentation her aide had brought in, the medical report, the parentage assessment, the civil registry confirmation from the Accord's secondary diplomatic station that confirmed what the parentage assessment implied. He had been standing with the specific, patient quality of someone who had been waiting for this confrontation for 14 months, and who had spent most of those 14 months preparing for it. Lyra stood at his left. She had the quality of someone who had been preparing for this confrontation too, in a different way. Not the operational preparation of someone assessing threat environments and building response frameworks, but the personal preparation of someone who had been rehearsing the words she would say to her mother when the words became necessary. The rehearsal had been thorough. She was discovering, standing in the chamber, that thorough rehearsal and the actual moment were related but not identical. Queen Sira Yath set down the documentation. She was 58 years old. 30 years of ruling. The specific quality of someone who had governed through 3 decades of the political complexity that civilizations accumulated, the succession crises, and the factional conflicts, and the diplomatic negotiations, and the 1,000 other dimensions of running a sovereignty that required continuous, comprehensive attention. She had managed all of it with the quality that 30 years of managing significant things produced, which was the quality of someone who knew what they were looking at and knew what to do about it. She looked at Davan. The look had the specific quality of the fury underneath the composure, not uncontrolled. Because the Queen's composure was structural, it was not a performance over a calm interior, but a discipline applied to an interior that had significant things happening in it. The fury was the significant thing currently happening. The composure was holding it. "You," she said. The word had the weight of being the beginning of something considerably longer. "You are the father." "Yes," Davan said. "You married my daughter." She said it with the specific, contained quality of someone stating facts that she was not yet finished responding to. "Without my knowledge, without the court's knowledge, without the sovereignty's protocol." "Yes," he said. "You are human," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment with the fury and the composure simultaneously. He looked back at her with the direct, patient quality, not defiance, not performance, not the managed quality of someone holding a position for the sake of holding it. The quality of someone who had come to this chamber with things to say and who was waiting for the moment when they could be said. "You have something to say," she said, not an invitation. The observation of someone who had been reading people for 30 years. "Yes," he said, "when you're ready to hear it." The Queen looked at him. She had been ready to hear many things in 30 years of this chamber. She had not been prepared for that specific response delivered with that specific quality. "Speak," she said. He began with the 11 months before the marriage. He described them with the specific, accurate quality of an intelligence assessment, the factual record, the documented behavior, the pattern analysis that the documentation supported. He did not editorialize. He did not accuse. He described what had happened with the precision of someone who understood that the Queen was a 30-year ruler who would know the difference between accurate assessment and constructed narrative, and who needed the accurate assessment. The crown heir's death, the succession reconfiguration, the 3 court factions and their repositioning in the 11 months that followed. He described the factions with the accuracy that the station's communication logs and the background documentation and his own analytical training had produced. The Queen listened with the full quality of someone managing significant anger while simultaneously processing information that was, she was a 30-year ruler. She knew what accurate intelligence sounded like. And what she was hearing sounded like accurate intelligence, and the content was not comfortable. "The Karath faction," he said. "Their repositioning after the crown heir's death was toward the succession line. The specific direction of the repositioning was toward the second daughter, toward your daughter, beginning in the 5th month after the crown heir's death." "How do you know the direction of factional repositioning?" the Queen said. "The station's communication logs," he said. "I had security function access to the logs. The Karath faction's communication pathway to the station, a specific administrative channel they had used in 3 prior instances I could identify, became active in the 5th month. It became significantly more active in the 7th. What did the communications contain? The 7th month communication was framed as a routine court inquiry about the diplomatic rotation status, he said. The content included a specific request for information about your daughter's social contacts at the station. The framing was security protocol. The request was not security protocol. Security protocol for junior royal family members doesn't include social contact reporting to court factions. It includes reporting to the Queen's security office. The Queen was very still. The request was to whom, she said. To the station's administrative coordination office, he said. The request was fielded by the office's deputy coordinator, who processed it as a routine inquiry and responded with a summary of your daughter's social engagement calendar for the preceding 6 weeks. The deputy coordinator responded, she said, without verifying the request's authorization, he said. The framing was sufficient for a deputy coordinator to process as routine. The deputy coordinator had no reason to suspect the framing. She was quiet for a moment. Continue, she said. He described the 9th month. The Veth faction made direct contact with a member of the station's administrative staff, he said. Not a communication inquiry, a direct contact. A meeting in the station's secondary commercial district between the Veth faction's external liaison and the station's records management specialist. What was offered, she said, a position in the Veth faction's courtside operation, he said, in exchange for information about your daughter's activities and associations, specifically communication records. The Queen's expression shifted slightly. Not visibly enough for most people to read, he read it. You know the records management specialist, he said. It was not a question. She looked at him. I know the family, she said. The specialist was appointed to the station in the 2nd year of the diplomatic rotation program. The appointment came through the administrative coordination office. She paused. The Veth faction's external liaison made the contact in the 9th month. Yes, he said. The contact produced a working relationship. The records management specialist began providing communication summaries to the Veth faction's external liaison beginning in the 10th month. Communication summaries, she said. The station's communication system produces automated summaries of outgoing diplomatic communications for the administrative record, he said. The summaries are less detailed than the underlying logs, but contain sufficient content for most administrative purposes. The records management specialist had access to the summaries as a standard function of the position. He put the documentation on the chamber's formal presentation surface. The Veth faction used the summaries, he said, to construct a record of your daughter's activities and associations over the 9 months of their monitoring. The record was accurate in content and misleading in framing. Each individual item in the record was something that had happened. The framing of each item was constructed to suggest that the sum of the items indicated a pattern of behavior that it did not actually indicate. The Queen looked at the documentation. She looked at the specific framing, the construction visible when you knew what you were looking at. What pattern? She said. That your daughter had been conducting unauthorized communications with Accord Intelligence Services, he said, using her diplomatic posting as cover for an intelligence relationship that the Sovereignty's court had not authorized. The chamber was very still. Lyra at Davan's left looked at her mother. The quality of her expression was the quality of someone who had known this was in the documentation and who had been waiting for the moment it was said. The construction is false, Davan said. Your daughter had no intelligence relationship with any Accord service. The communications the Veth faction documented were standard diplomatic attaché communications. Contact with Accord diplomatic personnel in the course of her legitimate posting function. The framing was constructed to make standard diplomatic communication appear to be something it was not. Why, the Queen said. He looked at her. Because the constructed record, if presented to the court, would have required your daughter to defend her conduct through the court's formal process, he said. The formal process in cases of alleged unauthorized intelligence relationships requires the Sovereignty's Court Protocol. Section 14. The subject of the allegation to be placed under court supervision pending the investigation's completion. Court supervision, she said. Under the protocol's assignment structure, he said, Supervisory responsibility in cases of this type is assigned to the senior court faction with relevant security jurisdiction. The Queen said nothing for a moment. She knew the answer. She said it anyway. The faction with current relevant security jurisdiction. Veth, he said. She looked at the documentation. She looked at the constructed record. She looked at it with the 30-year quality of someone who had seen factional political maneuvering at its full depth, and who was seeing, in the documentation, the specific depth of this instance. The formal process timeline, she said. 6 months minimum, he said. Under the current protocol, during the 6 months, the factional pressure around the succession would have intensified. The Veth faction's supervision would have produced the obligation relationship they were building toward. She was quiet. The investigation's conclusion, she said. The record's construction, a formal review would have found the construction. A formal review requires a counterpetition, he said, filed by someone with standing. The counterpetition process in the current court composition requires. The standing calculation is complex in a succession crisis period, because the succession uncertainty affects the factional balance, and the factional balance affects the standing calculations. Filing a counterpetition against the Veth faction in the current composition would require either the Queen's office or an aligned faction with sufficient standing, and the aligned faction landscape in the current period is thin, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at the documentation for a long moment. She looked at the construction and the framing and the 9 months of accumulated material that the Veth faction had been building toward a specific deployment. The Karath faction's formal proposal, she said. The candidate they were building toward. Yes, he said. In the 11th month, the trajectory was toward a formal proposal submission. The specific timing, the Karath proposal was being built to submit in the 13th month. The Veth faction's constructed record was being built to deploy as a countermove at the same moment, creating a situation where your daughter was simultaneously the subject of a formal marriage proposal and a formal conduct investigation. Both processes running simultaneously, she said. Both initiated by factions, he said. Both requiring your daughter to respond to processes she hadn't initiated while the factions managed the conditions around the responses. The Queen looked at the documentation. She looked at the chamber. She had the quality of someone who had governed through 30 years of factional politics and who was seeing, in the documentation, the specific architecture of something that had been built over 9 months with the careful quality of builders who understood the structure they were building toward. The marriage, she said, was in the 12th month. Yes, he said, 1 month before the Karath proposal's intended submission, she said. Yes, he said. The marriage removed the proposal's eligibility, she said. The court's protocol for formal marriage proposals in the royal succession line requires the proposed party to be unmarried. Yes, he said. And without the proposal pending, she said slowly, the Veth faction's constructed record lost its strategic timing. The record was built to deploy at a specific moment, he said. The moment was the Karath proposal's pending status. The record's function as a countermove to the Karath proposal was its primary application. Used outside that context, deployed without the proposal as the strategic backdrop, it was more likely to draw scrutiny of its own construction than to achieve its intended effect. She looked at him. You married my daughter, she said, to remove the eligibility for the Karath proposal and to foreclose the Veth faction's strategic timing. I married your daughter, he said, because I wanted to marry her, and because removing the Karath eligibility and foreclosing the Veth timing were also the outcome. Both of those things are true simultaneously. He said it with the direct quality that had been his throughout, not managing her response to it, giving her the accurate version. The Queen looked at him for a long moment. The two things being simultaneously true, she said. You are telling me that. Yes, he said, because you need the accurate version. The managed version. The version that presents only the personal dimension or only the political dimension is less useful to you than the version that is accurate. She looked at him, she looked at Lyra. You told her all of this, she said to Lyra, before the marriage. Lyra looked at her mother. He laid out the assessment, the evidence, the options, she said. He told me what the marriage would do and what it wouldn't do and what the risks were. He asked what I wanted. She paused. I wanted to marry him separate from the political situation, but I wanted to understand the political situation fully before deciding. He made sure I did. The Queen looked at her daughter with the specific quality of someone seeing something they had not previously seen clearly. "I require time," she said. "Yes," Davin said, "of course." She looked at him one final time before she left the chamber. "You did not flinch," she said, "when I entered." "No," he said. "Why not?" He looked at her. "Because I knew what I had done and why," he said. "And because you were going to need the accurate version. The accurate version required me to be steady enough to give it." She looked at him for a long moment, then she left. The time required was 4 days. He knew it would be longer than an evening and shorter than a week. He had assessed the Queen's processing pattern from the station's background documentation and from the 14 months of watching the Sovereignty's court from the security function's vantage point, and the pattern was: significant things were processed through engagement rather than withdrawal, and the engagement required the time the significance demanded, and the Queen was precise about not concluding before the processing was complete. 4 days was what the significance demanded. He and Lyra were in the administrative district's diplomatic guest quarters, better appointed than his previous station accommodation, with the quality of spaces prepared for people whose presence was significant enough to warrant the better appointment. They were not confined. They were asked to remain on Sorath Prime, which was a different thing and which he had expected. On the second day, the Queen spoke with Lyra alone. He was in the guest quarters working space when Lyra came back from the 2 hours. She sat in the chair by the window and was quiet for a moment, looking at the administrative district's view. "How was it?" he said. "The most honest conversation I have had with her in my life," she said. She was quiet for another moment. "I didn't know that was possible." He looked at her. He did not ask more than she offered because the conversation had been hers and her mother's. On the third day, a messenger came from the Queen's office. The message was brief. The Queen would see him in the working room adjacent to the formal audience chamber at the 9th hour the following morning. Alone, he read the message. He read the location, not the chamber, the working room. He had not been in the working room. He knew it by description and by the administrative records references to it. The room the Queen used for the significant non-ceremonial conversations. The chamber was for ceremony. The working room was for the actual conversations. He prepared for the 9th hour with the specific, thorough quality of someone who understood that the next conversation was the conversation the chamber had been building toward, and that the building required the preparation to match it. He brought 3 additional items of documentation that he had not presented in the chamber, items he had assessed as relevant to the next phase of the court's political situation, and which he had held back because the chamber conversation had needed the primary items, and the additional 3 would have been too much for a single presentation. The sequencing mattered. He was precise about sequencing. The working room had the quality he had expected, 30 years of significant non-ceremonial conversations in the walls. The specific accumulated character of a space that had been used for the actual decisions rather than the ceremonial ones. A table, 2 chairs, the Queen at the table when he entered. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat. She looked at him with the assessment quality, not the fury from the chamber, which the 4 days had processed into something more complex. The 30-year quality of someone reading a person at the depth that 30 years of reading people produced. "The Strategic Intelligence Division," she said, "before the diplomatic security work." "Yes," he said. 6 years, she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You left the analytical work because knowing without action was the specific cost of it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "The diplomatic security function is proximate," she said. "The protection is immediate." "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I understand that cost," she said. 30 years of ruling produces the specific cost of knowing what is actually happening and being constrained in the action the knowing requires. The institutional constraints, the factional politics, the protocol that moves at the speed of institutional processes. She looked at the table. "The cost is real." He did not say anything because she was not asking him to respond to this. She was saying it. "The Veth faction's constructed record," she said. "I reviewed it against the station's underlying communication logs last night." He looked at her. "The division's archive," he said. "Yes," she said. "The logs are accessible through the diplomatic division. The comparison," she paused. "The construction is visible when you compare the two. The framing is applied to communications that the raw log shows as standard diplomatic function. The construction required someone with access to the summaries, but not the underlying logs. The records management specialist had access to the summaries," he said. "The underlying logs require a higher authorization level." The summaries are sufficient to construct a misleading record, she said. The underlying logs would have shown the construction, but the court's formal process uses summaries as the evidentiary standard for initial investigation authorization. The protocol was designed for efficiency, he said, not for the specific case where summaries have been deliberately constructed. No, she said, it wasn't designed for that case. She paused. You identified the construction because you had access to both. The security function's access level includes the underlying logs, he said. The analytical training recognized the pattern. Constructed records have specific signatures. The relationship between the summary and the underlying log shows a particular quality when the summary has been framed rather than simply generated. You had seen the signatures before, she said. In the strategic intelligence work, he said. Yes. She was quiet. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. She had the quality of someone conducting the final stage of a 4-day process, the stage where the processing produces the conclusion. The Veth faction's constructed record, she said. The counterpetition, filed from the Queen's office with the underlying logs as the evidentiary basis. Yes, he said. The Queen's office has standing in all court processes. I will file it tomorrow, she said. He looked at her steadily. The Karath faction's formal proposal candidate, she said. The candidate's family history, the factional alignment, the shape of the alliance the proposal was designed to create. She paused. I would not have authorized the alliance. I assessed it would not serve the sovereignty's current strategic position, he said. It would not, she said. But the formal proposal, once submitted with factional support behind it, would have required a formal response through a formal process. The process for declining a supported succession line marriage proposal in the current court composition is politically costly. The marriage removed the proposal's eligibility before it was submitted, he said. The decline cost was not incurred. Yes, she said. She was quiet for a moment. My daughter, she said. Tell me about her, not the political situation, her. He looked at her, he told her. He told her about Lyra's specific intelligence, the quality of someone who engaged with actual complexity rather than managed versions of it. The patience that came from understanding that things that mattered required the time they required. The specific honesty about her own limits that produced better outcomes than the confident version would have. He told her about the 9th month, when Lyra had read the factional documentation he had compiled, and had sat with it for 2 hours, and had then described, with precise accuracy, the 3 dimensions of the situation that he had not yet fully articulated to himself. He described this with the specific quality of someone describing something that had surprised him genuinely. Not performed surprise, actual surprise, the surprise of someone who had underestimated a thing, and who was being honest about having underestimated it. He told her about the morning of the decision, not the marriage's formal registration, the decision, which was different from the registration in the way that the significant thing was different from the documentation of the significant thing. The quality of how Lyra had made it, the full information reviewed, the options assessed, the questions asked and answered, and then the decision made with the completeness of someone who had understood what they were deciding and who had decided. He told her all of it with the direct, honest quality that had been his throughout, not managing the Queen's response to it, because the Queen had earned the accurate version, and the accurate version was the only version worth giving. When he finished, the Queen was quiet for a long moment. The child, she said, the succession implications. I know them, he said. Your daughter knows them. We discussed them before the pregnancy and are discussing them again now. You decided to proceed knowing the protocol's implications, she said. Yes, he said. Why, she said. He looked at her. He gave her the accurate version. Because your daughter wanted a family, he said. Because I wanted one with her. Because the protocol implications and the political environment are real, and are not more real than the reasons. She looked at the table. She looked at the working room. She had the quality of someone who had arrived at a conclusion and was in the moment before saying it. The conditions, she said, around the child's position in the sovereignty's succession structure. The court's protocol produces a specific position for a child of mixed parentage. The protocol's position is not favorable. She looked at him. The conditions are mine to manage. I have been managing conditions for 30 years. He looked at her steadily. I was wrong, she said. He waited. About the situation I walked into in the audience chamber, she said. I was not wrong that the situation was significant or that the protocol had been circumvented or that the disclosure had been long overdue. I was wrong about what the situation was. She looked at him. I walked into the chamber prepared to see a man who had taken advantage of my daughter's position and her distance from the court's oversight to enter a relationship that served his interests and circumvented the court's authority. The surface facts supported that interpretation, he said. Yes, she said. The surface facts supported it, the depth did not. She paused. The depth is what the 4 days have been about. He was quiet. She looked at the table. She looked at her hands. My grandchild, she said. She said the word with the specific quality of someone saying it for the first time in its full meaning, not as a succession consideration or a protocol category, but as the actual thing the word described. A person who was going to exist, the child of her daughter and the man sitting across the table from her. Yes, he said. I would like the relationship with the child to be the relationship I failed to build with my daughter in the years before the diplomatic posting, she said. I am telling you this because you will be a significant factor in whether that relationship is possible. He looked at her. The relationship with your daughter is yours and hers to build, he said. I won't be a factor against it. I know, she said. I am asking something different. I am asking whether you will be here. If the conditions permit it, he said, and if your daughter chooses it, I will be where she is. The conditions, she said, are mine to manage. She looked at the documentation he had brought, the primary items from the chamber, which she had reviewed over the 4 days. She looked at him. You brought additional items, she said. I can see it in how you're sitting. He looked at her. After a moment, he almost smiled, the specific, restrained quality of someone who had been read accurately and who was acknowledging the accuracy. Yes, he said. 3 additional items. I assessed them as relevant to the next phase of the court's political management. I held them from the chamber presentation because the chamber needed the primary items and the additional 3 would have been too much for a single presentation. You sequenced the information, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him. Show me, she said. He put the 3 additional items on the table. She read them with the Queen's full attention, the complete, precise, 30-year quality of someone who had been processing political intelligence at this depth for 3 decades and who was processing these 3 items at the same depth. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. The Karath faction's reconfiguration, she said. After the counterpetition is filed, the timeline you've assessed. 3 months for the primary reconfiguration, he said. The specific movement within the faction that the counterpetition will trigger. The 3rd item documents the internal faction communication patterns that indicate where the pressure points are. The reconfiguration will follow the pressure points. The pressure points are the secondary houses within the Karath alignment, she said. The 3 secondary houses whose commercial interests are not well served by the Karath faction's current political position, but who have been in the alignment because the alignment offered succession-adjacent influence. Yes, he said. The succession-adjacent influence was the Karath proposal's value to the secondary houses, without the proposal's eligibility, and with the counterpetition changing the political landscape. The secondary house's calculation changes. They become available for realignment, she said. Yes, he said. Within 3 months. The 2nd item documents the commercial interest overlap between the 3 secondary houses and the sovereignty's Eastern Trade Development Framework. The overlap is significant and has been underutilized because the secondary houses have been in the Karath alignment, and the Karath alignment's position on the Eastern Trade Framework has been not favorable to its development. She looked at the 2nd item. She looked at the commercial interest documentation. She looked at the specific, detailed analysis of the overlap that the 2nd item contained. This analysis, she said, the depth of it. 6 years of strategic intelligence work, he said, and 14 months of watching the sovereignty's court from the security function's vantage point. The commercial interest patterns were in the station's background documentation and in the communication logs. She looked at him. You have been watching my court for 14 months from the diplomatic security function, she said. It is the security function's nature to watch, he said. I watch the things that are relevant to the threat environment. The court's political structure is relevant to the threat environment around the people I am protecting. My daughter, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at the 3 additional items. She looked at the table. She looked at the working room with its 30 years of significant non-ceremonial conversations. You are, she said, considerably more than a diplomatic security specialist. "I am," he said, "the person who married your daughter and who is going to raise your grandchild, and who brought the documentation you needed to manage the court's political situation across both phases." She looked at him. "And the person," she said, "who told me the accurate version when I walked into the audience chamber in fury and did not flinch." "Yes," he said, "those are all the same person," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at the documentation. She looked at the working room. She looked at the person across the table from her, who had married her daughter without the court's knowledge, and who had done it with the specific, careful quality of someone who had understood the situation at its full depth, and who had acted in the way that the full depth required, and who was sitting across the table from her now with the patient. Direct quality of someone who had nothing to manage and nothing to hide, and who was simply there. "Davin," she said, his name, not the formal address. "Yes," he said. "My daughter chose well," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said, "she did." The counterpetition was filed from the Queen's office the following morning. The Veth faction's constructed record was submitted to the formal process with the underlying communication logs as the evidentiary basis. The comparison between the constructed summaries and the underlying logs was visible in the formal process, in the way that it had been visible to the Queen when she reviewed them the night before, visible in the specific, technical way that formal processes made things visible when the evidentiary standard required the comparison. The formal process moved at the speed of institutional processes. The Queen managed the conditions around the formal process with the quality she had been managing conditions with for 30 years. The specific, comprehensive attention to the factional responses as they developed. The secondary House realignment that began in the 3rd week after the counterpetition filing. The Karath faction's internal reconfiguration that followed the shape Davin had assessed. He was in the sovereignty's court during the formal process, not in an official capacity, not in the diplomatic security function, in the capacity that was developing as the court's political situation developed, and as the Queen's management of the conditions produced the conditions that permitted the development. The capacity was not yet fully defined. It was in the process of being defined, which was the process that the Queen was managing, and that Davin was participating in with the specific, patient quality of someone who understood that processes that mattered required the time they required, and that the time was not wasted if the process was real. Lyra was in the process with both of them, her own participation in it, which was different from his and different from her mother's, and was the participation of someone who had been in the diplomatic posting, and the 14 months, and the audience chamber, and the 2-hour conversation with her mother, and who was, in all of it, the person who had made the decision with full information, and who was not uncertain about the decision. The grandchild would be born in approximately 7 months. 7 months was sufficient time for the formal process to conclude, and the secondary House realignment to complete, and the counterpetition to produce the factional reconfiguration that the assessment had projected, and the conditions to be managed into the shape that the Queen was managing them toward. 7 months was also, Davin understood, the duration of a significant transition, not only in the court's political landscape, but in the specific, personal landscape of a queen who had governed for 30 years and who was, in the working room and the 4 days and the accurate version given and received, becoming something different from the ruler who had walked into the audience chamber in fury. Not a different ruler, the same ruler, but the ruler who had said I was wrong in the working room and who had said my daughter chose well and who had looked at the word grandchild with the quality of someone saying it for the first time in its full meaning. That ruler was the same 30-year ruler, and also something more than the 30 years had previously allowed to be present. Possible was the beginning of the relationships that mattered. The documentation was filed. The conditions were being managed. The accurate version had been given and received in both directions. The grandchild would be born in 7 months and would grow up in the conditions that were being managed now, in the working room and the court and the counterpetition and the secondary House realignment, and the conversation that was ongoing between a queen and her daughter, and the man who had married her daughter, and who was, in the ongoing conversation, the same person who had stood in the audience chamber and not flinched. The working room had 30 years of significant non-ceremonial conversations in its walls. It had this one now, and the one that would follow it, and the ones after that.